Choosing the right range DPS class for Mythic Plus can make a huge difference in your gameplay. From maximizing damage output to having the right tools to stay alive, not all range classes are created equal. But which ones stand out the most in WoW currently? In this video, we're breaking down the top 5 range DPS classes, analyzing what makes each one powerful, unique, and effective for different playstyles. Stick around to see if your favorite made the list or if there's a new one you should consider trying. Number 5 on our list is going to be Augmentation Evoker. Now, I'm not sure if you would actually want to call them a DPS. They're more of a support style sort of class, and they're almost in a section of their own. However, when you queue up to play Augmentation Evoker, you do select the DPS role. So we're going to keep them in the DPS list as there's nothing else to really compare Augmentation Evoker against. And Augmentation Evoker has been in the mix for quite some time now, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. So Augmentation Evokers by themselves don't do a whole bunch of DPS. Like we kind of said, they're more of a support class. However, their main role is to buff their allies' defensives and to help them do additional damage. Now, as they are probably the number 1 DPS to pick, we're going to put them at number 5 because they're not typically the best at solo pushing because they rely on a decently coordinated group to see all that value. As you are buffing other people, you do rely on the other people in your group to do their rotation accordingly, to use their cooldowns efficiently. So you're really going to see Augmentation Evoker shine in those high keys where you can coordinate your buffs with your allies' cooldowns. Okay, let's talk about some of the pros and cons for bringing Augmentation Evoker to the group and why you might want to play them. Well, one of the main pros is going to be survivability. With the 15-second death timer through Challenge with Peril that's been introduced in Season 1, staying alive is as important as ever. So the extra defensive options that Augmentation Evoker brings allows your group to pull more mobs, which will exponentially increase your group's clear speed. Now, your main focus as an Augmentation Evoker is going to be keeping your buffs up, such as Even Might and Blistering Scales, and ensuring that you are efficiently tracking those, because if those do fall off, your group will lose a significant portion of their damage or defenses. Now, with some of the obvious pros, one of the main cons with bringing Augmentation Evoker is going to be losing a DPS during a fight. Certain bosses may stun one of your DPS allies or even teleport them to another platform, such as the final boss in Necrotic Wake. And when this happens, your group loses a massive amount of DPS as there's nobody for the Augmentation Evoker to buff. So that 1 DPS actually counts for something more like 1.5 DPS players instead of the normal 1. We also saw something very similar to the Soulbound Goliath in Waycrest Manor. When a DPS gets stunned, sometimes the Augmentation Evoker just doesn't have enough DPS to break a player out of a stun effect. And we especially see that in higher keys as health starts scaling exponentially. Now let's quickly discuss how they match up with the rest of the DPS specializations. So currently, Augmentation Evoker is listed as an S tier DPS, and not only are they S tier, they're pretty much ran in every single high-end composition at the moment. And with Augmentation Evokers, we can't really look at the numbers in terms of raw DPS because their whole kit revolves around buffing other players' DPS. But as we can see on this list here, they're currently running the highest keys at 18s. And if we look at Raider.io leaderboards, pretty much every group has an Augmentation Evoker in them. And another thing you can do is just sort by Mythic Plus score. You can see that Augmentation Evoker is coming out on top here as well. Now, one of the reasons we decided not to put them number 1 on our list is because they're not necessarily a pug-friendly specialization. And in our last video, we included Preservation Evoker in our list, and a lot of people are pretty upset with that, even though that they are one of the stronger healers. They're not necessarily one of the most pug-friendly healers to play. So even though Augmentation Evoker at the high end of play is pretty much in every group composition, we're just going to keep them at number 5 on our list for now. And then taking a quick look at the top 10 leaderboards in terms of Augmentation Evoker specifically, this is what those leaderboards look like. These are the keys that they've ran. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the spec population distribution, and it looks like Augmentation Evoker does see quite a bit less play than most of the other DPS specializations, coming out about 1% of the overall DPS player base. Moving on to the number 4 spot on our list, we have the Destruction Warlock. Destruction Warlock is one of those casters that do better as key levels go up because there's some setup time associated with their playstyle. So if you are running lower keys, you're probably not getting the most value out of your DPS rotation because the mobs are just simply dying before you can get your setup. However, once you do start pushing higher keys, Destruction Warlocks are insanely good at their sustained AoE cleave. Destruction Warlocks work by building up your soul shards with your Immolate and Incinerate spells, then choosing between their big spenders, either Chaos Bolts or Rain of Fire for their AoE damage for dense trash packs. Going into the pros and cons here, Destruction Warlock does bring some pretty good utility to the group. Not the best on this list, but it is there. They are very valuable to a high-end composition. I mean, they have battle reses, they have cookies, they have demonic gateways, they have their Shadow Fury AoE stun. The list goes on. And not only do they bring excellent utility, but they are very tanky for a caster. So they have their built-in Soul Leech, and a portion of the damage that they do is then going to be converted into healing. So in high keys where a Warlock is pumping damage, the healer's not going to really have to focus near as much on healing them as a normal DPS. And then just to add to their defensives, they do have spells like Unending Resolve and Dark Pact. Now for the cons of Destruction Warlock, well, they can't really move and do damage at the same time. They're almost like a sitting glass cannon. And if you can't hardcast Incinerates and Immolates, you're not going to be able to generate enough soul shards to do damage with. Another con of Destruction Warlock is kind of like we discussed earlier, they do require some ramp time to get the ball rolling. So spreading out those Immolates, getting multiple stacks of Rain of Fire out, this all takes some setup time. Now taking a look at the numbers, Destruction Warlock is at the top of B tier. They are fringe A tier. And in terms of just raw DPS, they're averaging about 1.8 million DPS at the high-end range. And if we do sort by Mythic Plus score, we can see that Destruction Warlock does make the top end of our chart here, coming in at the number 10 overall spot in terms of both melee and range DPS. Then here's a quick look at the top 10 leaderboards just to see the top keys completed on Destruction Warlock. And then taking a look at Raider.io, they make up about 2.5% of the overall distribution among DPS specializations. Moving forward on our list, coming at the number 3 spot is going to be Frost Mage. So Frost Mage is one of my personal all-time favorite range DPS specializations because it doesn't require a whole bunch of setup time to get the damage going. Now in the sustained damage department, they might not match something like a Destruction Warlock, but Frost Mage is all about burst damage and uptime on your Frozen Orb. Frozen Orb will then get you procs of Fingers of Frost, and that's going to give you the opportunity to spam your Ice Lance. So Frost Mage is a very fun and engaging gameplay loot. Getting into the pros and cons, so some of the pros with Frost Mage is they do bring pretty good utility to the group. Again, not the best on this list, but it's still pretty good. They bring Arcane Intellect and Time Warp. So your healer, of course, will always appreciate that extra intellect. And it's also very mobile for a ranged DPS specialization. And this should not be overlooked because most ranged DPS specs are similar to like a Destruction Warlock. They're like standing glass cannons, and it can be difficult to do a whole bunch of damage while on the move. So since Frost Mage is so proc based with Fingers of Frost, they almost play more like a hunter rather than a traditional caster. There are a ton of instant cast spells, and Frost Mage is just great in pretty much all content ranges, which is a huge plus in my opinion. Now, one of the cons to this specialization is you do require some coordination with your tank. If the tank pulls the mobs out of your Frozen Orb, it can be very detrimental to your DPS. Most of your setup and damage is going to be synced with that Frozen Orb, so it's very important you don't send it too early. Another con of Frost Mage is they don't have the sustained tankiness similar to something like an Aug Evoker or Destruction Warlock. They can survive burst damage fine, but they don't have that built-in Soul Leech to kind of help heal them through that slow rot damage. So over the course of a dungeon, you're probably going to have to pump a little bit more healing into something like a Frost Mage rather than a Destruction Warlock. All right, taking a look at the numbers for Frost Mage here. So Frost Mage is in the middle of A tier against all the other DPS specs, giving it a pretty significant bump from where we just were with Destruction Warlock. In terms of raw DPS, averaging very similar to Destruction Warlock. Again, we're going to kind of see this number repeated a few times throughout this list, but 1.8 million DPS at the high-end range, coming in at the number 5 overall spot. Then if we sort by Mythic Plus score, we can see that Frost Mage comes in at the number 6 overall spot in terms of both melee and range DPS. And then right quickly, here is a look at the top 10 leaderboards to see the top keys completed on Frost Mage. And in terms of spec representation, they're making up something around 2% of all DPS players. All right, up next on our list, coming in at our number 2 spot is going to be Balanced Druid. And Balanced Druid is in a pretty good spot at the moment. and they're great to bring into any group due to all the survivability that they bring. So in terms of utility for the group, they probably bring the best utility out of any DPS that we've talked about so far. That's where a lot of their value is, more than the other specs, is all the utility that they bring. So there's a whole bunch of things that we could potentially list out here, but some of the notable ones obviously are going to be like Mark of the Wild, the versatility buff, and they also bring Nature's Vigil for a decent amount of off healing. You know, it's on a 1.5 minute cooldown, which means you can use this on pretty much every single trash pack. So it's great to use, you know, right as your tank starts to pull, you can really help offset a big burst of damage that might go out on your tank or on your party. Now, getting into the pros and cons here, where Balanced Druid is really going to shine is in their AoE damage. So Balanced Druid typically works by spreading out your Sunfire, Moonfire dots and spamming Wraths and Starfires to generate a bunch of Astral Power. All of this Astral Power can then be spent on overlapping Starfalls or Star Surges, depending if it's an AoE or if it's a single target encounter. And I like to kind of call the Balanced Druid the unholy DK of casters. You're just spreading dots absolutely everywhere. They're not super hard to put up, and there's just numbers flying all over your screen. Now, the downside of this is while they do have excellent AoE damage, they do lack a bit more in single target damage. So if you are really pushing high keys, you will want someone who can focus a little bit more on single target damage to kind of make up for your lack of it. And we're not saying that Balanced Druid necessarily has bad single target damage, but compared to the other specs on this list, it is lacking a bit more. And of course, very similar to Destruction Warlock on our list, they do have some ramp time, so it takes time to spread out all those dots to generate the Astral Power, then get your stacks of Starfall ticking, unfortunately. So if you are running lower keys, Balanced Druid may not be the best option because, again, trash is just going to be dying so quickly, you're not going to be able to see your damage ramp. But again, in terms of the utility that they bring to the group, probably the best or second best from a group play standpoint on this list. Okay, let's take a quick look at how they match up to other DPS specializations. So currently, Balance is on the high end of A tier against all DPS specs, just right above Frost Mage in our list. Then in terms of raw DPS, they're averaging, again, same number here, about 1.8 million DPS at the high end range, coming in at the number 4 overall spot, again, just above Frost Mage. If we sort by Mythic Plus score here, we can see that Balanced Druid does come at the number 4 overall spot. And here's a quick look at the top 10 leaderboards to see the top keys completed on Balanced Druid. And then taking a look at unique class population here, it looks like they are just shy of 3%. All right, moving on to the number 1 spot on our list. This is going to be Elemental Shaman. So Ele Shaman has seen a lot of changes in the War Within and typically has been lacking in the damage department compared to a lot of the other DPS specs in previous expansions. But that has been more than corrected here in War Within, and they also bring a new class buff, and that is Sky Fury. So that has been one of the things that has kind of held them back in previous expansions as well, is them just not bringing a good buff to the group. So Elemental Shaman does very similar utility to a Balanced Druid. However, they do bring a better poison dispel. So the dungeon rotations that we're seeing do have a ton of poisons in them. So Elemental Shaman and just Shaman in general is just great to bring pretty much every week. So not only do they have that great utility similar to a Balanced Druid, but they also have a good damage profile. They don't lack in either single target or AoE damage. So going into the pros and cons, let's quickly take a look at this utility that we've been talking about the whole time. So we do have Ancestral Guidance. We have the lowest range CD kick in the game. Wind Shear, we have our Lust, we have Poison Cleanse, we have a class buff, and then we have a whole bunch of other stuff. We have Cap Totem, probably 10 other totems that I can't remember exactly off the top of my head right now, but they're pretty much the jack of all trades when it comes to utility at the moment. So as an Elemental Shaman, you're going to be building up Maelstrom with your Chain Lightnings and Lightning Bolts, and you're going to be spending that Maelstrom on Earthquakes and Earth Shocks. And you'll be using your Storm Elemental, Tempest, and Stormkeeper as some of your main cooldowns. Now, it's not all great for Elemental Shamans, especially when it comes to button bloat. So sure, Ele Shaman does have a ton of utility, but it is a bit tricky to pull off. Being able to quickly access all your utility through all the totems that are just kind of scattered throughout your bars, it's just sort of a general problem with Shaman across all their specializations right now. So they're just kind of difficult to hotkey, to be honest. It's been a problem with Shaman since their inception. They just have a ton of buttons, a ton of button bloat, and it will really fill up your action bar quickly. So you can get around that with certain weak auras and add-ons to kind of help you manage your totems better, but it is a minor con. Now the bigger con of the two is they don't have the best defenses either. You know, they have Earth Shield and they have Astral Shift, and I would say that they're probably one of the more squishy range DPS specs on this list. Alright, now let's take a look at how they match up to other DPS specializations. So currently Ellie is mid A tier against all the other DPS specs. So on this specific list, they are right below Frost Mage. Then in terms of raw DPS, they're actually averaging the highest on this list at 2 million DPS at the high-end range, coming in at the number 2 overall spot. And funny enough, they are just right below Enhancement Shaman. So Shaman at the moment is doing some of the most damage in the game for Mythic Plus. So their insane damage coupled with some of the best utility in the game is why they come in at our number 1 overall spot in this list. Then just a few more things to look at here. We can sort by Mythic Plus score and see that Ellie Shaman comes in at the number 7 overall spot. And here is a quick look at the top 10 leaderboards to see the top keys completed on Ellie Shaman. Then in terms of class representation, coming in at nearly 4%. Alright guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We also have a Patreon page in the description if you guys want to help out and support our work. We'll see you on the next one.